thanks for joining us. I suppose you should be getting some deserved time off at this stage. It's been an intense 7 weeks. I'm sure it was intense building up to it, but how was the World Cup experience for you?
Oh, it's fantastic, Rory. I mean, it's, you spend 4 years planning for an event. Obviously, you plan every scenario. What you probably don't plan is some of the good things that happen. And, great 6 weeks, not just for Rugby World Cup and World Rugby, but for the sport, I think.
That 6 weeks itself, is it just step away and let the rugby do the talking, or are you very hands-on during that period? How much of a logistical challenge is it to pull off once it actually gets going?
I think from a sort of delivery point of view, most of the work is done. Certainly from our perspective as the event owner, there's an organising committee of 500 people that are frantically working away, whether it's transport, security, spectator services. And then for us, it's a bit more focus on the sport. So match management, match official appointments, any sporting issues that are coming up that we've got to deal with. So the tournament becomes less the logistical part for us and more the sporting part, which is a nice way to play it out.
It's been universally acclaimed as being a great tournament. I think between bums on seats, between the quality of rugby that was played, it got the champions it deserved in New Zealand, who were exceptional throughout, and it just seemed to be pulled off very, very well. It must be very satisfying. What were the big successes for you over the last kind of 6-7 weeks?
All of those things, I think. I mean, when we start that journey for World Cup, and we always knew a tournament in England would be a massive event, in terms of the engagement across a range of audiences, but it's about making it a massive event globally and making sure that we're attracting new people to the sport. We're attracting new audiences, not just domestically, but internationally, and we've seen a lot of that. So I think there's that part of the audience engagement that's so important. World Cup's our one chance, obviously once every 4 years to do that. And then really it's about, as you say, the rugby and making sure that we've got the right conditions so that actually that opportunity for rugby to shine is really taken. And, thankfully, whether it was the weather, the teams, the infrastructure that was put in place, they managed to pull off, and great credit to all 20 teams, managed to pull off a great tournament. And those are the bits that, as much as you can plan for, it's hard to plan the delivery of that. But it's a testament to 4 years of investment and hard work.
I know we're very immediately after the event itself, but what can you tell us about the success of the event and the numbers that you're kind of seeing in terms of, between social media engagement, between TV audiences, that sort of thing? I mean, where does it stack up, say, in previous World Cups and also benchmarked against kind of other, international sporting events?
I think for us, we went into the World Cup with that sort of perennial sports event debate of, is Rugby World Cup the third biggest event in the world? And I've always answered that question a little bit, maybe flippantly, by saying I don't really care that much. What I care about is this is an event that's growing, and this is an event that's helping rugby grow. But I think probably on a lot of those measures, we have seen ourselves probably put in that position behind Olympics and Football World Cup as a significant major event. On most measures, in terms of spectators, in terms of people in fan zones, we're about twice the size of the last World Cup in New Zealand, so 2.5 million tickets sold and spectators in the stadiums, which was 98% of total capacity, which is right up there at kind of FIFA and Olympic levels. So phenomenal engagement in the venues. I think in a funny kind of way, more pleasingly than that was 1 million plus people in fan zones. So we saw matches like New Zealand Tonga in Newcastle, not a traditionally strong rugby territory or rugby town, with 57,000 people in a sold-out stadium and another 27,000 people next door in a fan zone. And hopefully there are kids in the fan zone who are seeing rugby for the first time, who are now playing mini rugby on a Sunday morning in their local club, and that's really the level of engagement we want. So domestically, very strong. I think internationally, the key for us was making sure that the tournament absolutely worked in all the traditional rugby heartlands. So, and it did, and the figures are great in New Zealand and Australia and South Africa, obviously England, France and Ireland. But also, some great stories in new markets, and the two probably that stand out for me, Germany as one. Rugby's growing really quickly in Germany. It's a sport that's developing very fast, both at 7s and 15s, and we took the approach a few years ago of getting as much of Rugby World Cup as we could on free-to-air television. That's the strategy, obviously, maximising the number of eyeballs on the sport, and we had audiences of 3 million plus for 25 matches on free-to-air television in Germany. That can only be good for the growth of the sport. And then the other real, I guess, standout success story from a television, but from a tournament perspective, is Japan, and everything to do with Japan's involvement in Rugby World Cup 2015 and their second game against Scotland. Television audience of 25 million people for Rugby World Cup pool match in one country is absolutely astonishing.
We'll speak about Japan specifically in a minute because obviously that's the next step. But you mentioned Germany, and you mentioned, I suppose we are at a technology conference, and the fact that you can now identify where people are talking about your game, where people are watching your game, does that lend itself to kind of identifying the new territories where World Rugby need to go and exploit that interest, and over the next 4, 8, maybe it might take 12 years, but that these countries will be at the table and competing at these tournaments in the future?
Absolutely. I think technology is absolutely for us at the heart of that. So whether it's obviously monitoring not just television audiences in the traditional sense, but the social media engagement that we had, and we had huge social media engagement across the tournament. I mean, the Rugby World Cup Twitter handle used twice every second for the entire duration of the tournament. Some 68 billion Twitter impressions across the 7 weeks. So phenomenal engagement, and being able to track some of where that engagement's happening, as you say, allows us to be a little bit smarter about investment. Also be a little bit smarter about our engagement with media and social media going forward. So, we picked a number of languages, for example, at the start of the tournament to target, Japanese being one of them, with an eye on the future. German wasn't one of those languages that our social media and digital media platforms were available in, but it might be next time now as a result of starting to track those audiences. So I think we know that investment in elite level rugby takes, a reasonable period of time to come to fruition, and we will look at territories like Germany where the sport is growing quickly and say, okay, is there an 8-year plan leading up to World Cup in 2023 that sees Germany competing with more kids playing and a stronger playing base? So, absolutely, I think technology will allow us to be smarter about where we are targeting both the coverage of rugby but also the investment in the sport.
Aside from the logistics of managing this over the next 4 years, but how closely do you just have to keep an eye on trends, what's coming out? I mean, in 2011, Twitter was there, but it wouldn't be the global player that it is now. In 2007, it probably wasn't there at all, really. I mean, we don't know what will be there in 4 years' time. How closely will your team monitor that over the next couple of years to make sure that when the World Cup rolls around, you're using the right things to try and engage with the audience as much as possible?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, we're lucky, from my point of view, it's about managing a once every 4-year event, but from a World Rugby point of view, obviously we have a World 7 series that's 10 months of the year, 10 venues around the world. We've got, under 20s, we've got Women's World Cup, we've got other sevens events, so we have a number of opportunities to be keeping close to those changing technologies, and sevens in particular, as a very dynamic version of the sport, is a great way of dipping a bit of a toe in that water, I guess, as the circuit moves around the world. And we know, for example, that our social media and digital media engagement next year for Rugby Sevens in the Olympics in Rio will be one of the measures on which the IOC are judging us as a sport in terms of success. So this year's World Cup gives us a great platform, but it's very much a case of no complacency and keep building towards that future audience. I think as well for us, not just on the social and digital media side, but looking at how technology is being used in sport generally. We used Hawkeye extensively in this World Cup, which was a real, to some extent, leap into the unknown for us. But we did a lot of testing over the last 12 months. But that extensive use of technology actually within the sport itself was a big move forward. So I think we'll now see more progression in rugby in that sense.
In terms of the tournament itself, I mean, you couldn't have wished for a better start. The day after the opening ceremony, Japan go and beat one of the global giants of the game, which just spurred interest throughout the world in this tournament, and seemed to continue. There was big moments almost every weekend, which must be exactly what you're looking for.
Yeah, exactly that, Rory. I think what happened in Brighton with Japan and South Africa probably changed the approach that a lot of teams took to the tournament. To see a team be that brave, be that bold, if you like, in terms of taking on one of the sort of traditional superpowers, and the nature of that win, the universal acclaim, if you like, of that win, and the confidence it gave not just them to continue, but I think Romania, Georgia, Tonga, Samoa, USA, some of the smaller or so-called smaller teams. So it did change a lot of things, and to happen so early in the tournament was fantastic from our point of view.
Conversely, I suppose England going out was not what you were looking for. I would presume, as a host nation, when they did lose to Australia that time, and we had that week of introspection before the Uruguay, and the introspection kept going in the English media throughout. I mean, is that a case of locking yourselves in your room and figuring out how you manage your way through that, or did you always expect the English people to still continue to support the tournament?
Yeah, I think we did. We did expect that support to continue. We knew obviously a lot of tickets were sold long before a ball was kicked. But we also had plans, contingency plans for any of those eventualities. We knew that if England went out, we need to promote the festival atmosphere a bit more. it was never going to be just about the home team. I think we've seen that a little bit in previous Rugby World Cups as well, where rugby fans are great at getting behind whatever team they're watching, not just the home team. England going out, obviously, from a tournament point of view, was disappointing in one sense. Probably the fear was that the media coverage in the UK would drop away a bit. But again, because the rugby was so good, the fans were so engaging, we had the most sort of compelling and competitive Rugby World Cup in terms of winning margins we've ever had. So we really had a lot of very close games, and I think that kept a very engaged audience. And it made no real difference in the end, which is incredible.
Something I suppose I wanted to ask you about was that engagement and the fans in the stadium versus the fans at home, and keeping, I suppose, both sets of fans happy while also, making money out of the tournament, having the commercial realities of it, between the kind of break before the start of the game, ads during half time. I know a lot of people here were unhappy with, say, the amount of ads during the game. I mean, how do you manage that balance of having a successful tournament from an audience point of view, but also a commercially viable tournament?
It's tricky, I think, and it's getting harder, that balance. I think, we, as I said earlier, we had a strategy really in as many places as possible having free-to-air television. That comes to some extent at the price of those broadcasters needing to get a return on their own investment. So, ad breaks, whether it's here with TV3 or ITV in the UK, obviously a part and parcel of that. We hope that those broadcasters we work with, and we think they are respectful of the sport enough to make sure they're never missing live action. They're not sort of damaging the integrity of the tournament. But obviously they've got to, as I say, make a return on their own investment, and that investment, of course, is crucial to what we can do with the tournament, with the sport going forward. I think we're lucky in one sense for Rugby World Cup in that we've had a very stable group of sponsors, very stable group actually of broadcasters over a number of editions of the tournament, and so we're able maybe to work with them a bit more and not necessarily dictate terms, but appeal to them to work with us in certain areas, and we'll continue to do that as we move forward, definitely.
That decision to go with free to air, it's there's obviously big debate over that every time rights come up and all sorts, but you seem to see a real benefit of reaching as wide an audience as possible.
Yeah, I think rugby's at that stage now, and again, we've come off the back of a wonderful Rugby World Cup. We're building towards something very new in Japan in 2019, and as the sport's growing, as we're trying to get more men, women and children playing the sport, we've absolutely got to keep projecting the values and the virtues of rugby. And we believe that free-to-air television, in most territories at least, is the best way to do that and get the best possible coverage and get people wanting to be involved in the sport. So I don't see that strategy changing in the near future. There are some territories where maybe we've got to be a bit smarter to get the revenue and kind of broadcast reach balance right, but absolutely going to continue with that.
I suppose the other thing to balance with entertainment, aside from the commercial reality, is the officiating of the game and making sure that every decision is right, and the complexity that is the rugby law book, because it is such a complicated game, and when you're trying to reach new audiences, it must be a real challenge. I suppose we saw on the opening night the TMO was used for a long time. It was a massive talking point, but it seemed to be problem solving along the way, that by the time the final came around it wasn't as much of an issue. Is that a real challenge between the lawmakers and also the commercial side of World Rugby, and trying to make sure that while you're getting the decisions right, the entertainment doesn't suffer as a result?
Yeah, I mean, less so the commercial side, but I think exactly that. I think it's finding that balance between consistent, accurate, credible decision making from a match official point of view and engagement both in the venue and obviously the audience at home. And I think probably that first weekend, even though we've done a year of testing with Hawkeye and the TMO protests and protocol, everyone tightens up a little bit, and we saw some challenges. I think we saw as the tournament went on, the match officials much more comfortable with that interaction in the television match official process in particular. I mean, our overall view of engagement with Hawkeye was it was great. We used it for television match official. We used it very extensively for player welfare, so injury, identification, management, particularly in concussion. We used it with the teams in providing more content than ever before for their analysis, and we used it in the disciplinary process as well. So, it's looking at those changing and innovating technologies and seeing what we can do. But I think you're absolutely right, but absolutely making sure it's not damaging the spectator experience. It's got to enhance rugby, not just make it more complicated. You
mentioned Japan, and obviously they gave that massive lift to the tournament at the start, won 3 of their 4 pool games, but just didn't quite do enough to reach the quarterfinals. But given where the tournament is in 4 years' time, it must give you massive momentum going into that 4 years and kind of just engaging the Japanese public. They're already interested, so that must give you a head start.
It does. I mean, we've done a lot of work in the last 2 years with Japan 2019, trying to get them ready. we're in an unusual situation. We're 9 months before Olympic Games in Tokyo in 2020, so we're conscious that we've got to get a lot of our planning right up front, get out and sell tickets ahead of Tokyo 2020 being on sale with tickets. So we've started that process very early. I don't think we could have ever dreamed of the momentum and the kind of surge that their performances in this World Cup would give us, and the interest now in Japan in rugby is, off the scale compared to where it was 2 months ago. So the challenge then becomes keeping that momentum going over the next probably 18 months to 2 years before really we're engaging with their audience on Rugby World Cup. But they've got a Super Rugby franchise starting in Japan next year. They've got some good competition in the June international windows over the next couple of years. So really we've got to work with them to really, that new audience needs to stay with rugby.
It must be a very different challenge organising a tournament in Japan. I mean, just logistically dealing with a hugely different culture.
Yeah.
It's a very different challenge to any World Cup because it's always been in the traditional nations. So can you talk a little bit about that, just what it's like dealing with the Japanese as they try and bring this tournament to their country?
Yeah, I think from our point of view, they're starting with a different set of experiences to our previous hosts. I mean, I've been involved with 4 World Cups now in Australia, in France, in New Zealand, and now England, and to some extent putting on a Rugby World Cup in those territories in terms of understanding and delivering the sport has been relatively straightforward. The tournament, of course, gets bigger and bigger, so it's everything that goes around the sport that gets harder. I think for Japan, it's more back to basics, so can we make sure we've got all those building blocks in place? The match schedule part, the venue part, which we've already done a lot of work on them with, getting the right team bases in place and delivering the rugby side and then building the rest around it. I think when it comes to their cities, their engagement, when it comes to, for example, transport infrastructure, they're in great shape. It's a fantastic country in terms of those infrastructure issues. It's just making sure we get the rugby right, I think, and get the right platform to deliver. They've got an organising committee of 50 people already, so they're making great strides.
You've gone from a very small established rugby nation to the biggest rugby nation in the world, and now you're going to a completely new territory. Is there a perfect place to host a World Cup, or is it a movable feast? Can you go back to a New Zealand, or say, I suppose we have an interest in Ireland 2023, but the scale of England and the fact that you have all the things right there in place, Japan, you mentioned the logistics are good there. Are you moving more towards bigger countries, or is there scope to go back to a New Zealand or an Ireland?
I think definitely. I think every World Cup, certainly the ones I've been involved in, is different, and the scale when you want it, I think, is there now with the World Cup. 2.5 million tickets, as I said. We use very big stadia, obviously Wembley, Twickenham, Olympic stadiums packed out, up in Manchester, Newcastle, etc. But actually, the crowds were fantastic in Gloucester, in Exeter, in Milton Keynes. You can put Rugby World Cup on in lots of different types of venues. And, I've talked obviously a lot with Ireland about their bid for 2023, for example, and there'll be a great mix of venues here. All of the nations we've got interested in hosting Rugby World Cup in the future, including the US, who were part of that 2023 process for a little while. Absolutely, it's a scalable event. I think, we look at Rugby World Cup and we talk to governments about Rugby World Cup and we say, this is a relatively low-risk, high-return event to stage as a nation. It doesn't require huge infrastructure investment like an Olympic Games or a FIFA World Cup traditionally has. So, we want this to be an event that can still be hosted by, all those countries that are interested in Rugby World Cup, whether they be, big or small.
When you speak to the New Zealand team or the management after the game, they always talk about how they can still get better even though they've just won 2 World Cups in a row. It is frightening. How can the World Cup get better? What do you see over the next 4 years? What are the challenges that you'll need to you're setting yourself to improve and to make this great tournament even better?
Yeah, I think, constantly looking at every part of the tournament and what we can do, either not always better but differently. And a lot of that is looking at, our objectives for a World Cup are quite simple. This is our one chance every 4 years to show the world the best of rugby, the best of our players, the best of the spectators, the values, what rugby is all about. And I think there are lots of different ways of doing that. It's not just about the product on the field, but also about the engagement that the people have with the sport. So, as I said, fan zones this time, great festival of rugby events around the tournament, cultural events, other things that become part of that 7-week engagement. And those are the things I think we want to see increase, so that people's touching the sport for the first time are getting the best possible experience, because then there'll be people who want to play the sport, watch the sport, whether they want to go and referee the sport or coach the sport, just to be engaged in rugby in all its forms. So it's looking at different ways of doing that, constantly evolving. Again, technology is a massive part of that, not just how we deliver the sport, but how we show people the sport. And you know, social media, this has been the social media World Cup for us. That's been a huge part of engaging a global audience.
How happy are you with the format itself? I mean, there's been calls for, say, a place, you know, between the bottom 10 teams. There's also, you know, there is it is a long tournament, and it must be quite difficult to keep people engaged over that period of time, particularly when the knockouts begin and it becomes a weekend event. It must be quite difficult. Is the format right at the moment, or is there scope to kind of work on that and maybe improve it over the next maybe 8 years to get the next 4 teams up and expand it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've looked a lot at 24 teams. That would be, I think, from a globalisation of the sport point of view, that would be a great thing to do. I mean, a lot of our challenges in terms of changing the format of Rugby World Cup come from the fact that, as you say, it's already quite a long event. And of course, rugby by its nature, you know, players can't play every 3 or 4 days. And that, you know, that's another area, obviously, scheduling we've got to look at for the future. So I think if in 8 years' time, or maybe 12 years' time, we were looking at the next 4 teams being truly competitive, we'd certainly look to increase the number of teams. The challenge with a plate competition or an alternative format is that, you know, we've arrived, I think, at a format that people understand. It's quite straightforward. There are pools, there's a knockout stage, teams advance. To play with that more, it's hard to keep the broadest possible audience interested. We might keep the die-hard rugby fans interested, but not necessarily everybody else. And it actually becomes quite expensive to stage that. You know, you're keeping a lot of teams in that particular host country for a long period of time. Can we keep sponsors and television audiences and audiences buying tickets, you know, engaged with all of those games? Possibly not. I think it's one we'll keep under review, but I think for Japan 2019 will be very much 20 teams, 48 matches, and the same format.
Just to finish up, I suppose I'll ask you your own personal highlight of the last 6-7 weeks. What was it that stands out for you when you look back on this in 10 years' time? What will be your own personal highlight?
I think, you know, Japan and everything to do with Japan and their success, their fans, the way that I think sports fans from every other country that were in the tournament engaged with everything that Japan had to offer was fantastic. And it is a great platform, no doubt, for the next 4 years. But I think also the quality of rugby, probably, you know, when we started the tournament, if there's one thing we want, it's the rugby to be the best it can be. And, you know, from a World Rugby point of view, we've invested high performance investment in a lot of those countries that are competing in a World Cup. And to see the Canadas, the US, Japan, you know, all the teams really, Romania and Georgia, really showing the best of what they have to offer. That's the legacy piece for us to build on. So I think that's the most pleasing thing. And ultimately, you have a great tournament and probably the best team won, and that, you know, that in itself is a great tribute.
Well, Alan, congratulations on a fantastic tournament, and best of luck over the next 4 years as we look forward to Japan in 2019.
Thanks, Rory. Thanks very much. Thank you.